for coming out on this horrible rainy night. We have a treat tonight. My name is Bill Cavanaugh. I'm the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology here at DePaul. I haven't mentioned yet. Please introduce yourself afterwards. I'd love to meet you. Thanks for coming out. It's my delight to introduce Father Orobator, who's been with us for a couple of weeks, and it's the second time that he's with us. And we've enjoyed his presence. There was an article in the tablet last year that came out. An interviewee, whose name I can't remember now, suggested that he would either be the next African Pope or the next African Pope would be somebody very much like him. So that was a pretty high compliment. Father Orobator is the Provincial Superior of the East African province of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. So like the current Pope, who is also a Jesuit Superior. He's also a lecturer at the Hekima College, Jesuit School of Theology in Nairobi, Kenya, and the author of several books, From Crisis to Kairos, Theology Brewed in an African Pot, and as the editor of Reconciliation, Justice, and Peace. We have those last two volumes for sale at the back of the room as well, so please do avail yourself of that opportunity. We'll have Father Orobator's talk and then time for questions afterwards, so please join me in welcoming
Thank you very much, Will, and good evening. It's certainly a pleasure to be back here at the the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology for the invitation. I'd like to mention what I call 3 caveats as a way of helping to situate and frame the theoretical predilection that underlies my position in this presentation. The first has to do with the title, Religion of Underdevelopment, Practice versus Performance in Africa. The title is a working title that loosely translates a long-standing research interest in religion in Africa. And this research takes the form of a critique of the course, direction, and orientation of religious affiliation and allegiance in 21st century Africa. And hence, I consider this critique open to further critique in order, as much as possible, to build a comprehensive and accurate narrative of what religion means and how it functions in Africa. The second caveat, I admit that this critique, as I've laid out in the course of this presentation, is heavily influenced by my dual heritage. I am a convert to Catholic Christianity, and I continue to derive what I consider to be significant, some would say inappropriate, inspiration from my background in what is commonly known and often in certain quarters derided as African traditional religion. This personal investment could also account for certain biases that will filter through my presentation. but hopefully would not diminish its pertinence and the imperative of attempting to understand the fascinating intricacies and complexities of religious allegiance and affiliation in Africa. The third caveat, in speaking of practice and performance in Africa, I recognize the tendency to generalize about the continent. As much as it is possible, I will make a conscious effort to identify particular instances that underpin some general statements that I will make about religious affiliation and allegiance on the continent of Africa. The temptation to reduce Africa to a simple and homogeneous entity, or what Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie calls a single story, remains the bane of research and scholarship across several disciplines that focus on the continent, and I believe no exception. Now, speaking of religion in Africa in the 21st century, the scenery, especially south of the Sahara, confronts us with a fascinating, even if perplexing, panorama. This combination of fascination and complexity occurs at several levels, and I will limit myself to only two examples. Now, strikingly, of course, the first relates to the strong evidence of growth and expansion of religious affiliation and allegiance. There is nothing new in this, and abundant documentation exists on this phenomenon of surging growth. The axis of growth and expansion has risen steeply since the turn of the 20th century. The same is true, I speak of Christianity, but the same is also true of Islam, whose advent dates further back to the 7th century in North Africa. A second element of fascination and complexity concerns the task of categorization. What constitutes an accurate and adequate taxonomy of religion in Africa? Now, desirable as it would seem, this task continuously towards the best laid methodologies. To stay with Christianity south of the Sahara, the proliferation of sects and churches can appear bewildering. If we believe Gambian scholar Lamin Sane, the preponderant factor that accounts for this religious diversity and intense growth is a process known as vernacularization. The thesis of vernacularization holds that as more and more Africans are able to access the Bible in their vernacular medium through translation, they gain confidence not only in appropriating its message, but are empowered then to launch their own brand of appropriate Christianity. That is, to translate Christianity into their local context. There is a subtlety to this point about the translatability of Christianity. It is the fact that vernacularization foils any attempt to foist regulatory canons on the formation and fragmentation of Christian churches and communities. In other words, vernacularization triggers a liberalization that in turn promotes proliferation of myriad Christian bodies. The result then is a complex diversity of ecclesial communities. Now, while it is still possible to speak about mainline churches such as Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches, the vast majority of ecclesial units defy easy categorization or classification. The labels at our disposal no longer capture the defining characteristics of these constantly evolving and mutating ecclesial units. There is a persistent fluidity characteristic of their nature and their identity, their theologies, and their beliefs. And this fluidity simply belies any neat, fixed, or static categorization. Presently, the terms Pentecostal, Evangelical, Protestant, Charismatic, Zionist, Independent, Instituted, etc. embody a frustrating relativity that almost neutralizes the relevance of these labels as denominational boundary markers. Now, other recent tags such as Bible-believing, Spirit Christianity, prophetic, I believe, fare no better. The sum of these preliminary remarks, to put it simply, as I see it, is that however we view it, religion is doing well in Africa. But the question that I raise is equally as simple. How do we view religion in Africa? Now, the dominant approach to or appraisal of religious affiliation and allegiance in Africa south of the Sahara tends to focus substantially, and I would add almost disproportionately, on demographics and statistics. Again, I limit myself to two examples for consideration. Philip Jenkins is convinced of where the new phases of Christianity are emerging and what geographical and demographic spheres constitute the next Christendom. They are, as you might guess, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Now, when we probe the rationale behind this projection, numbers surface as key factors and considerations. Similarly, John Allen is convinced of the shift of the center of gravity to the global south as one of the significant trends that will revolutionize the future Catholic Church. Like Jenkins, he argues that Latin America, Asia, and Africa will lead the church, albeit in the direction of social conservatism and evangelical Pentecostalism. Now, I do not dispute the importance of demographics and statistics, characteristic of their approaches. After all, as we know, numbers don't lie. The numbers and statistics could be qualified justly as staggering, such as the fact that Christianity and Islam have recorded exponential increases, especially between 1910 and 2010. Now, what I caution against is the temptation or the risk of absolutizing numbers to the detriment of incisive analysis and probing critique of the trend, credibility, and authenticity of religious affiliation and allegiance in Africa. And I hasten to add that this point is not lost on Jenkins and Allen. Notwithstanding the statistical fascination, what set in the wider horizon of Africa's predicament, the growth of religion throws up a sharp and disconcerting irony. Economically and politically, the continent's fortunes seem to regress in inverse proportion to the fortunes of Christianity. It will be pointless to adduce statistics to portray the economic, social, and political condition of the continent. And it is debatable, I would say, whether to qualify the situation of the continent as hopeless or as hopeful. Such ambivalence was aptly captured in the famous About Turn of The Economist magazine, which labeled Africa as a hopeless continent at the turn of the millennium and represented a hopeful continent in 2011. To the question of how we view religion in Africa, another can be added. Why does religion flourish on a continent suffused with crisis and conflicts? Why does religion thrive in the midst of underdevelopment and widespread dysfunctionality? Notable attempts have been made to confront these questions, and in the process launch a critique of religion in Africa. One example that I will give is the work of New Zealand scholar of religion, Paul Gifford, who has undertaken extensive empirical studies of Christian denominations in Africa, especially in West and East Africa. Another example is Ugandan theologian Emmanuel Katongole. In his recent book, The Sacrifice of Africa, Katongole is convinced that Christianity operates an essentially inadequate paradigm, limited at best, flawed at worst. Whereas Christian performance concentrates on applying soothing spiritual, pastoral, and political salves on complex and complicated historical challenges, it fails to impact the course or direction or progress in these realms. And so Katongole would wonder then, what accounts for the dismal social impact of Christianity in Africa? Why has Christianity, despite its overwhelming presence, failed to make a significant dent in the social history of the continent? Now, Katongole's preferred solution consists of a reimagination of Christianity's core values as social ethic and the creation of new narratives that overcome Christianity's reticence in order to generate effective alternatives. The difference that I find between Gifford and Katongole is that while Gifford limits his analysis mostly to an empirical account, Katongole offers theological alternatives. And this is not surprising. They come from two different backgrounds. But the general conclusion of Gifford is a serious indictment of churches and religious institutions for their failure to contribute to what he calls the radical restructuring of Africa's socioeconomic and political institutions. Now, Earlier, I asked the question, why is religion doing so well in the midst of crisis? I would like to reformulate this question, primarily because I believe that the challenge is not about effecting a conceptual evaluation or assessment. Rather, it's about rethinking the essence of religion. The question that I propose is simple. It is, why does religion work in Africa? Now, the empirical underpinning of this observation derives from, of this question, derives from the observation of religious phenomena in Africa. However you look at it, I believe religion works on this continent. And that is what explains the intensity of affiliation and allegiance. Doctrinal and dogmatic considerations matter less than practical and functional benefits of faith and belief. There is, in fact, a larger religious context or framework that foregrounds the functionality of religion in Africa. The framework is what I already introduced earlier as African traditional religion. Now, I opt to avoid the intellectual debates about whether to label it religions in the plural or religion in the singular, albeit I tend to lean towards the position of Tanzanian theologian Agbonkhianmeghe, for whom African religious traditions converge at a single source and constitute a unified reality. Now, to come back to the question, religion works. Why? How? When we pay close attention to the structure of belief in African religion, we discover a category of deities that hold sway over the allegiance of adherents exclusively on account of their functionality. Anthropologists in particular have generally termed these deities as lesser gods and juxtaposed them to what they call the supreme being. However, whatever we characterize as supreme being is rendered almost useless by the fact that there are rarely any cults, devotees, or shrines affiliated to it. And so there is a distancing and remoteness characteristic of this religious category. And in the face of this distancing and remoteness, African cultures south of the Sahara have tended to create a panoply of religious figures, beings, and deities that meet real needs. I am of the opinion that to label these as secondary or economic gods, as some scholars like Dominic Zahan have done, is to miss the point. From the point of view of the devotees, there is nothing secondary or economic about them. Simply put, for the adherents, these deities work. And I mean work in the transitive sense. They are important because they work or are perceived to work in the interest of their devotees in a variety of situations, especially at times of crisis, such as illness, threat of failure, struggle for survival, and threat of annihilation. So, religion works in Africa. Although I would be hard-pressed to offer empirical justification, I make the conceptual presupposition that this functionalist mentality characterizes the structure of religious allegiance and belief, whether in Christianity or Islam in contemporary Africa. As a way of conceptualizing and understanding how religion religion actually works in Africa, I would identify and distinguish two modes of functionality. The first is performance, and the second is practice. Performance and practice. This classification also takes into account the two questions that I raised at the start of this presentation, namely, how we view religion in Africa and why religion is doing very well in Africa despite evidence of widespread dysfunctionality. To begin with, performance generates simple, very simple, but superficial solutions to real and complex crisis situations. Performance capitalizes on the superficial aspects of religion and enhances the perception of their efficacy by adherents, either through particularized, simplistic theology or through the co-option of strategies that amplify such perceptions of efficacy. The common and obvious strategies employed in religious performance include, but are not limited to, the use of media technology, marketing strategies, and advertising techniques. Let me say here that the term performance cannot be patented for exclusive use in this discourse. Performance, as we know, is common currency in the description of phenomena and actions across the wide horizon of social science disciplines. I adopt it for use in this discourse in view of reaching a particular conclusion. And that is why, for example, I do not intend it as Agbonkhianmeghe does when he describes performance in relation to African spirituality as an artistic feat toward the discovery of beauty, which involves the process of both learning and producing meaning and constructing cultural norms and social identities. Now, to stay with Christianity south of the Sahara, there are at least three what I call emerging platforms where religion operates as performance. There is healing, particularly miraculous healing. There is prophecy or visions relating to the well-being, prospects, and fortunes of adherents. And there is deliverance, necessitated by the need to neutralize and eliminate real or perceived forces that stand in the way of socioeconomic advancement of adherents. Now, some in the audience would notice the absence of the much debated gospel of prosperity that claims that prosperity and success are divine recompense for faith, whereas poverty is the lot of people of little or no faith. I am convinced that the gospel of prosperity relates to and can in fact be subsumed under any of the three platforms. Now, when it comes to Islam, I would argue, at least on the continent, that performance operates on a platform of psychological intimidation and physical or material violence. Now, I hesitate to speak glibly of terrorism because it connotes many aspects that are not necessarily to be linked with religious allegiance or affiliation. But between Christianity and Islam on the continent, I would identify the following as further complicating factors of religious performance, and I will not go into the explanation at this point. There is, for example, the globalization of religious intolerance, there is the instrumentalization of religious allegiance, there is the commercialization of religious consciousness, and there is intensification of religious extremism. There are several examples of what I call religious performance. And I have chosen a quite recent event from the West African country of Ghana to illustrate. To set the context, a few weeks ago, the national currency of Ghana, the cedi, suddenly took a nosedive against all major foreign currencies. And the event sent shockwaves across the nation's economy and triggered a devastating inflationary reaction. In the ensuing national panic, one prominent Ghanaian Christian leader invented a Christian solution to the fiscal crisis of a rapidly depreciating cedi. Archbishop Nicholas Duncan Williams, who is the presiding bishop of the Christian Action Faith Ministries, attributed the problem to the work of Satan. And these are his exact words. I will not read them because I cannot imitate him in the way he expressed them. So I'll let you read the words for yourself. So he concludes, let the cedi rise in Jesus' name. Now, to reverse the satanic calamity of currency depreciation, Archbishop Duncan Williams commanded the resurrection of the cedi. Again, he's inimitable in this when he's in action. So I'll let you read that for yourself. So he commands the resurrection of the cedi and the release of the miracle for the economy. Now, theatrics apart, some reactions to such performance-based religious antics justly recognize them for what they are. And a case in point, also staying in Ghana, is the reaction of the former head of monitoring and evaluation of the National Democratic Congress, which is a political party in Ghana, Dr. Tony Andrew. His comments on the bishop's theatrics are worth noting, and I quote them here. And he says, at best, it is a comic relief, but seriously at worst, it is a big problem for us. Because it goes to reinforce the attitude, the undevelopmental attitude of Ghanaians. You attribute everything that is positive to God and everything that is negative to the devil. So the two names become the most commercialized, and then you become vulnerable to the exploitation of the clergy. Now, in my own view, the greatest threat that religious performance poses to Africa lies in its singular ability to create and reinforce a dualistic hermeneutical framework that opposes good and evil, and in the process effect a practical reductionism that spiritualizes all forms of socioeconomic and political crisis or challenges in private and in public domains. Now, in describing this penchant for spiritualization of all aspects of life, Paul Gifford prefers to talk about what he calls an enchanted worldview that sees spiritual causality everywhere. Now, I won't dispute Paul Gifford's position that this enchanted worldview derives solely from African beliefs in what he calls witchcraft. And I would also dispute Philip Jenkins' characterization of this proclivity for spiritual causality as simply what he calls pagan inheritance, or the continuing influence of pagan and animistic beliefs on African Christianity. I would dispute that. This enchanted worldview is also an invention and a potent instrument of the proponents of religious performance in Christianity and in Islam. As I do, whom I've quoted recently, perceptively notes, the principal tools of religious performance are exploitation and manipulation. There is no shortage of examples of religious performance, from the ludicrous to the dangerous. It is worth noting that besides the economic and fiduciary dividend of religious performance, its proponents or its entrepreneurs eventually succeed in wielding significant political influence in society. Now, as one analyst described Africa's latter-day self-styled prophets, they had mega churches with flocks running to millions. They preached but also mingled with politicians, have a certain mystique and are revered by many. When they talk, even leaders listen. The entrepreneurs of religious performance played incessantly to the gallery of Africa's cast of megalomaniacs, despots, and dictators. Nigeria's prophet T.B. Joshua, who is quite prominent on the web, of Synagogue Church of All Nations International, is legendary for the number of Africa's late, former, and serving presidents and heads of states listed in his fan base. You have people like the late Frederick Chiluba of Zambia, the late John Atta Mills of Ghana, the late Bingu Mutharika of Malawi, the current President Joyce Banda of Malawi, whose predecessor's death Prophet Joshua predicted, former Zimbabwean Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai, to name but a few. And a recent tragic example of performance is the case of the self-proclaimed Congolese prophet Joseph Mukumbila Mutombo, also known as God's last envoy to humanity after Jesus Christ and Paul of Tarsus, and who has led a band of followers in space of audacious, deadly attacks in DR Congo. Now, notwithstanding these impressive manifestations of performance, I would argue that performance exemplifies what I would call a weak religion. A weak religion, which is at best diversionary and misleading, or at worst manipulative and exploitative. Now, although I would credit R. Scott Appleby for this term, weak religion, I do not invest it with the same meaning of failure to mobilize the resources of religion for a sustained political action in the public sphere. Religious performance, I believe, is weak religion to the degree that a sophisticated and messianic cohort of opportunists and charlatans exploit the gullibility of adherents for narrow economic ends and self-serving political agenda. Analogously, Paul Gifford proposes and defends the idea that performance leads to a domestication of Christianity, by which he means that, as in the case of Kenya, for example, Christianity has become an integral part of the dysfunctional system. What I consider more illuminating from Agbonkhianmeghe is the notion of ambivalence. The internal structure and material resources of religion can serve dual and multiple purposes, depending on the controlling agent or overarching ideological and doctrinal proclivities of its protagonists. In other words, in line with my argument, religion can function as performance and as practice. Now, as you would have noticed, I have not defined the second mode of how religion currently works in Africa, even though I've alluded to it extensively. I've dwelt long on the mechanism, strategies, and examples of religious performance, and it will be fair and useful to offer a similar analysis of what I've termed practice. Again, I would like to set this mode in the context of African religion. What I've noticed is that in African religion, religious practice is essentially oriented towards enhancing and strengthening life, broadly considered. Whether in ritual, worship, or divination, the primary benefit of religious affiliation and allegiance is derived from and founded on the belief that practice enhances the life force of devotees individually and collectively. Now, it will be disingenuous to deny that there are no aberrations akin to performance in this religious framework, but these are frowned upon and never allowed to become normative elements within the structure or context of religious practice. A good example of aberrations within religious practice in African religion would be the much talked about witchcraft. But to carry on this conversation, let us note 2 points. Hekima has described African religion with the apt phrase of tradition of abundant life. So doing, he makes the argument that exploitation and manipulation do not count as virtue in this religious system. Secondly, Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, in his fascinating work of Africa, has demonstrated, and I believe convincingly, how in the practice of divination in the indigenous religion of the Yoruba of Western Nigeria, not only is the well-being of the devotee paramount, the diviner or the priest or the priestess, known in the local language as Babalawo, is unreservedly bound by the principle of gratuitousness. No reward is exacted, no toll is imposed for the practice of divination. Now, I see here a practice that is diametrically opposed to and contradicted by the current ethos of material reward or economic dividend that characterizes the performance of healing, prophecy, and deliverance in certain religious traditions. Practice, then, is the term that I reserve for religious observance or expressions that are not averse to probing the structural causes of crisis and violence, while drawing on the core values of its respective traditions as resources for strengthening and enhancing the well-being of adherents and affiliates. And examples of core values of practice in the Christian tradition, I would argue, include justice, solidarity, compassion, mercy, and charity. Just as there are examples of performance, I believe there are several examples of practice as a mode of religious functioning. Now let me quickly add here that in the way that I use the term, there is obvious resonance with praxis, especially as this latter is construed and applied in the tradition of liberation theology. With the exception that when I speak of practice, I do not just oppose it with orthodoxy. The conceptual and practical polar opposite of practice is what I call performance, as I've already mentioned in this conversation. I will just give two examples that are familiar to the DePaul audience here. And there would be Bishop Kairos of Torit in South Sudan. Katongole has presented a fascinating account of his religious practice, embodied in the foundation of Holy Trinity Peace Village in Kuron, South Sudan. As Katongole would argue, the practice inspired by Kairos is great for the reimagination and reconstruction of the socioeconomic, cultural, and political fabric of Africa. It is anything but the manipulation or exploitation of adherents. There is also Sister Rosemary Irumbe, the 2013 DePaul University honorary degree recipient. It's another example of what I would designate as religious practice. Her work towards the rehabilitation of young girls disempowered and dehumanized by a constellation of socioeconomic and political violence has been globally acknowledged. What is important here is that she explicitly believes that our mission to counter the humanizing forces is a concrete manifestation of her religious allegiance and affiliation, and it represents the practice of faith and hope as she understands it. I will refrain from indulging in multiplication of examples, but I believe the point is adequately clarified and illustrated by these examples. I hesitate to say that I'm concluding, because as I said, this is work in progress. As I mentioned in the beginning, what I have offered this evening are snippets of an evolving research that focuses on a critique of the direction and orientation of religion in Africa. At the risk of sounding like one pandering to the prophets and seers of religious performance, I conjecture that religion has a future on the continent of Africa, the bright future. How that future develops, or whether or not it is sustainable, will depend to a larger, not lesser extent, on the interplay of practice versus performance. Performance purports to proffer a simple, workable solution to the trials and tribulations of religious adherents and devotees in Africa. Oftentimes, the appeal of performance proves irresistible for society's losers and Christian elite. Practice, in my view, attempts to recover or surface core religious values for a sustainable and meaningful enhancement of human existence. Now, this might sound like that I'm sounding a note of despair, but I also conjecture that practice will struggle to register an enduring impact for the vast majority of religious adherents and devotees on the continent. However, a particularly hopeful note is the growing consciousness, and what I would say a groundswell of resistance to religious performance owing to the disillusionment and disaffection of adherents and devotees. Two striking examples from the traditions of Islam come from Mali in West Africa and Nigeria, also in West Africa, where both Christians and Muslims have found common cause in denouncing and resisting, and in the case of Mali, overcoming a particularly virulent strain of religious performance that unleashed a regime of terror on innocent Muslims and Christians. Muslims in particular, in some parts of West Africa, are plumbing the depths of their religious traditions to reclaim the core values of mercy, tolerance, and graciousness, in contrast to the actions of the marauding agents of sectarian violence. Finally, let me leave you with the words of veteran African churchman Henry Okulu. Everywhere in Africa, things are happening. Christians, and I would add, Muslims are talking, singing, preaching, writing, arguing. Can it be that this is an empty show? And that, my friends, is my question. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. That's terrific. We have time for questions, so please. We need to use the microphones. Is this being recorded? Okay, so if you would like to ask a question, if you would, please just come and use the microphone so it can be recorded. Oops.
Thank you for the presentation. I have two questions.
Three.
Start with work. Yes. The first one is that it's a reaction to I don't remember the name. I don't remember the name of the theologian who was speaking of religion and in its different manifestations speaks of vernacularization. Yeah. And I feel very uncomfortable with that word. Because as you know, you are studying that vernacular means slave. And from that perspective, this is the word that we are taking. I don't know where it takes it from. Maybe it's going to go to the book. I feel very uncomfortable. This is the first thing. And also, explain the saying that it's kind of liberalization and the proliferation of various ways of being Christians. And my question is, it's true that we have to express our Christianity in various ways, but does that mean that the everything is worth the same value? For example, these preachers who preach about the gospel of wealth, that my God is not a poor God. This is a manifestation of Christianity. Is there any kind of ideology or meaning behind all that? Because they should be, and they go and say, this is wrong, this is right. But to just say that everything is what? There is a danger there. And giving these people, the exact esteem, or if you want, the exact power with people who are trained, first of all, and who are not just installed people. I want to come back to that. The second thing is, I think that the
third one, I think.
No, the second question is, you have said that, you have pointed out that religion is investing portionally to development in Africa. The more people become Christian, the poorer the country becomes, or countries become. And you did not ask the question, why. But instead of answering this question, you decided to avoid the question and say how Christianity and say religion works. And my question is, why is that so? that the more people become religious, the poorer they become. This is a different answer. We decided to say sociology, how it works. It's a second thing. And the third thing is about the performance. You seem to have a kind of sociological description of what is performance. There is no there is no judgment of value to what is performance. You condemn performance in as much as it becomes a tool for manipulation and for exploitation of the people. But in itself, it is not say what value. And I want to come back to that. Because I, for myself, I think that what we call performance is what Kairos calls alienation. It is my understanding. Because to say, healing, I don't see how someone can be healed by prayer. If you are sick, just go to the hospital. Prophecy, I don't believe in this people will come with this or that. And this is what people are doing. And the third one was deliverance. And I don't believe in all this because people will come and say you are possessed, and it will be a way of getting money. So for me, this performance, you seem not to be condemned in that. You condemn it in as much as it's a kind of tool for manipulation. But myself, on itself, this performance, what is actually for this alienation, and it's not to go away.
Thank you. I expected the Jesuit to be the first to ask the question. But thanks, Paul, I really appreciate it. As I said earlier on, this is for me an evolving interest, research interest, and I really welcome, and as I said, critique to help expand then the scope of this interest. Let me say in response to your first question that first of all, Lamine Sane is a historian of religion and a highly respected figure in that field. It's not a theologian. I am interpreting him. Okay, so it's very, I do not claim that I have accurately read his mind or accurately reflected his theoretical position on this question. But when he talks about vernacularization, I would hesitate. I mean, we could argue about the linguistic roots of vernacularization, and I agree with you. But I think we need to see exactly what he's trying to convey. And I think as an observation of the process of expansion or growth or integration or contextualization of religion in Africa, I think it works. I mean, I think it represents or accurately captures the process in the sense that as people are able to almost literally hear the message of this religion in their own language or mother tongue, that in itself is an empowering process that allows them not to be bound by the canons of received interpretations, that they can actually hear and interpret for themselves and therefore assume the consequences of embracing this new religion. I think in that sense you have to give it to Lamine Sane. It's a very insightful observation. So when he talks about vernacular, and it's different for Islam, for example, because in Islam, the principle is non-translatability. But in fact, it is actually because of that non-translatability that Islam, of course, becomes an appealing religion also, and therefore able to grow. So I think it's a very fascinating category, so that the points you make then about, well, if this is liberalization, how do we judge the value of what comes out? Well, I wouldn't expect Lamine Sane to be the one to make that judgment, because again, he's a historian of religion. He's presenting or trying to articulate historical processes. But we could argue on a theological level, how do you assess this? And the question, and this is a word that is very big with Philip Jenkins, is the question of authenticity. How do you judge this, the authenticity of this process of liberal, and the outcome of this process of liberalization? And I would leave that as an open question. You also talked about poverty and religion in Africa, that I wouldn't put it that the more people become Christians, the poorer they become. That's not the point I'm making. I'm making an observation that if you look at the condition of the continent, and it's debatable, but again, I think it's fair to say that there's dysfunctionality in a number of areas. And yet, in spite of this dysfunctionality, religion remains appealing to people. And my explanation for that is precisely what I said about religion as being something that works. It is precisely because performance-based religion convinces, or is able to convince people that there is a solution for this. Even if not everybody becomes, in the category of the, shall we say, the elite or the middle class, but at least you have powerful symbols of how religion, in this case Christianity, can in fact make that happen. Can in fact, as they say, lift you up from poverty. And who are these symbols? If you pay close attention, the symbols are the leaders of these communities themselves. Because they set up themselves as exemplars of what you can become. Now, whether or not that happens, that's not the point. The point is, there is hope that with faith you can, as they say, overcome these obstacles.
And the point is that they overcome and they transport them by exploiting these people, the same people. They cannot be role models.
No, I'm not saying they are role models in the sense that I'm validating. What I'm saying is that for them, for the adherents, this is a very powerful symbol of what possibilities there are, in this religious or this denomination, you see. So again, it's a question of judging the value. If you notice, I'm struggling not to impose value judgments on this, because I don't know that I have read correctly, accurately, this evolving and what I call mutating process. I don't know that. So that's why I'm still reserving judgment and only stopping at the point of observing. But of course, in my observation, you also notice my frustration with a particular kind of performance. At the very least, my frustration with a particular form of performance. Which then leads me to the third question. What's the, could I condemn performance? Again, I would reserve my judgment. Because, as I said, I have a bias, you see. I'm coming from a dual heritage, which I describe as, Catholic Christianity and African religion. And these are heritages that have also marked my own outlook or my perception, perspective on the world. So as I read this phenomenon of religious performance and religious practice, I have my biases. And if you noticed in my presentation, I would be, let me put it mildly, uncomfortable with the duration of performance as it stands now. I would be uncomfortable with it. But to condemn it outright is not something that I think, at least in my position as someone who's trying to approach this as objectively as possible while admitting my subjectivity. I don't think that's the point we're at now. Because again, you would also need to look at this question from the perspective of people that are described as protagonists of performance. How does the TB Joshua explain his understanding of Christianity and how he puts that into real life practice? How would he explain that? How would a Mutombo in DRC do the same thing? How would a David Oduo, do the same thing in Kenya? So I think for reasons of, I would say, intellectual fairness, this is not at a stage where I think I should be making condemnation. I have my own biases, but I do think there's more listening that needs to happen to the other in order to form whatever we call a more fair assessment. But let me say that I recognize your frustration with this. I'm sorry I cannot come down, black or white on this, but I think that's something we still need to, as they say, watch. Let's watch this space. But thank you. Michael.
I have a question. I sense that you favor practice of performance, but
Yes.
what I grant you is looking to pursue. But as you describe practice, the question that came to my mind was, can you have non-religious practice in the way that you usually do? Which I think you can. And then what does religion add to it or distinguish from? I'm thinking of like the Communist Party or something like that. Or good NGOs, projects that are really doing good things, like the two examples you gave toward the end. Can you discuss how you're using practice and how that would relate to non-religious practices?
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. Yes, at first I would grant the point that it's possible to also apply these categories to if you like, religious, contexts or institutions. But again, when I talk about praxis or practice in this sense, I mentioned the idea of core values, which in this case would be religious-based, so that in my practice or in my performance, I'm explicitly referencing values from my tradition. Now, can these values become recognizable across, a non-religious platform? You could say yes. I mentioned values like justice, compassion, solidarity, mercy, charity. I wouldn't say they're exclusively. I wouldn't limit them, to religious use. But my point is that when you look at it from the point of view of the one who is involved in performance or practice, it's an explicit reference to these as core religious values.
Yes.
That's the kind of thing. Thank you. Another Jesuit.
Performance and practice. I'm not sure I get this right so correctly. Is performance concerned, let's say, with the masses, like the big set of the population, and the practice should be rather on the side of maybe the intellectual people, those who have moral awareness, those who raise more questions about the way they appropriate religion? If so, can you say that, because I feel as if there is a malaise in the way religion is being processed and lived. And more intellectual people in Africa are really raising these big questions, especially the question coming from traditional African religions to Christianity or Islam, and seeing whether this conversion has really gone all the way to the end, whether we got stuck somewhere in between. And religion, to some extent, is becoming, as Paul was saying in the second part of the question, and I think you mentioned that, part of the problem. It is really one of the key elements that could have failed Africa to some extent. So my question, I guess, would be, how do we really appropriate religion in the sense that, in a way that it is not only separating, I would say, the masses of the people and leaving them to the performances? How do we bring that practice to cease to be an elitist kind of thing, but really go to transform the performances that the people are trying to live, to make that the religious experience more authentic for all, not only for the elite, but really for a church that is trying to adjust.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. I would certainly affirm the point you make about the growing critical appraisal of religion and religion's role in the predicament of the continent. And of course, several would have mentioned, and I don't think this is coming simply out of a secular context or secularizing context, that religion in certain instances or in certain situations is perceived as in fact part of the problem. And in saying that, I also don't want to say that this is something that is peculiar to the continent. You know, again, we've had critique of religion, going way back, across history from different sources, sociological, anthropological, historical, etc. So we've seen that. I wouldn't say that in the way that I'm using the term, I would simply limit practice to an elite, context, therefore, that is able to raise questions. I wouldn't say that. I think it can work. It works in both contexts. I think, and if you look at practice, for example, or rather performance, what I call performance, and you look at the examples that I give, you'll be surprised at the appeal it has for a growing middle class. And I would say for two reasons in Africa. I would say for two reasons. First of all, there is a justification that yes, it does work. Christianity works, as a catalyst for social, mobility and economic advancement. It does work. And secondly, Christianity works to protect, or rather to consolidate the gains, of a particular middle class. So I wouldn't say it's, I wouldn't make that distinction along the lines of, the masses and then the elite. I think it works across the arm. Thank you.
I have a problem maybe you can help me with.
Yes.
I've been asked to give a response in about a month's time to a new documentary film released at the Sundance Film Festival in 2013 called God Loves Uganda, which is a documentary about the introduction of the virulent anti-homosexual laws in the Ugandan Parliament. The argument, I spent the afternoon watching this film, the argument made by the filmmaker, Roger Russ Williams, speaks to your issue of performance and performativity, and I want to make sure I understand it. This film talks about it, it's a feast of the grotesqueries of Pentecostalism. It's every manifestation and expression of glossolalia, being slave in spirit, all the exuberance and what to Westerners are frightening pictures forward is that after Idi Amin, there's a void. And the void is filled by Western American conservative evangelicals and Pentecostals. Rushing with money, rushing with television ministries, rushing with all these sorts of things. And they're the ones to blame for the brainwashing, in this case, of the Ugandan people into values and policy perspectives they would not otherwise hold. I have no truck with people who want to demonize homosexuals or who want to discriminate in the church or elsewhere on grounds of gender, all sorts of other things, for a whole host of reasons. But what I'm unpersuaded by is the sort of performativity of the critics of Pentecostalism at its most exotic, in an inverse way to what you're describing. The only explanation can be that the African people are dupes. They've been fooled. They have been sold a bill of goods by these sophisticated Westerners. No sense of agency among common people, among the middle class, among the entrepreneurs. As I think about my disquiet with that explanation for the rise of Pentecostalism and its right-wing political expressions in Ugandan politics, I wonder about the notion of performance as you described it as requiring a more empathetic posture toward Pentecostal forms of Christian practice. Otherwise, all you get are worked over sociological explanations of religiosity as deficiency, as compensatory, as elite manipulation, as some sort of bias. And so maybe you can help me think through the mirror side of performance and help me with my project.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you. I would say right away that on the question of agency, I am very reluctant to simply consider that the problem lies with the extroversion, what I call extroversion of Christianity south of the Sahara continent. That is, the view that says, the void is filled by, and therefore all the aberrations, so to speak, come from outside. Now, there is no question about the fact that there is a lot of influence in terms of the way Pentecostalism has developed. But two things I would say, first of all, that the whole idea of translatability and vernacularization, speaks to the question of agency as well. That as the forms have developed on the continent, there is an originality to it that may borrow from or be influenced by other, external forms. But the fact remains that there is some indigenous factor or some originality to this kind of agency. So that's the first point I would make. The second point I would make is that in terms of how it works, at this particular point, we also need to take into account, and I'm very, very convinced of this, we also need to take into account what in the local context, or you might say culture, makes this form of Christianity receptive, or make people receptive to this form of Christianity. So, and I think there is a lot in the local experience, or rather in the local context, that is, it would be too strong a word to say predisposes people, so that would be too strong a word, but at least that makes people receptive to this, and I think that needs to be explored. Okay. Now, on the question of performance, I also think that in evaluating performance, and this goes back to my point to we need to listen to and interpret performance as well through the perspectives and the perception of people who are actually its proponents. I think we need to, listen to and try to see or read the situation through their own lenses. To see, therefore, what is it that makes that the preferred way of responding. And that is why I think whatever analysis we conduct, as sociologists, historians, and anthropologists, it will not be enough to simply have our references as existing categories, so to speak, of how religion works. Drawing on theories, existing theories that explain how religions works. Because if you look at if you just take, for example, we say the example of Austin Weber, how he looks at Protestantism and how it works, and the whole ethos of investment, delayed gratification, internal asceticism. I mean, you could say all of that would be theoretical conceptual ways to read what is going on the context day. Well, that is not adequate. Because there is an agency, as you mentioned, that is indigenous, that is, I would say, original, and in fact creative. And we need to take that into account in our assessment of performance and in our reading of performance. Now, I don't know if this helps, but we can continue the conversation. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brother. Before I ask you to thank Brother Orobator one more time, just a few announcements. Remember, we have books for sale at the back. Please take advantage of that. We have evaluation form that we'd like you to fill that out with this event. That would be great. And we have more events to come. On next Tuesday, we have Maria Clara Bingamer, our visiting research scholar from Pontifical University of Rio de Janeiro. We'll give a talk on mysticism, witnessing, and community. March 4th, coming up soon, Matt Tan, who's with us from Australia, Singaporean Australian theologian who will be launching his new book, Justice, Unity, and the Hidden Christ, on March 4th. And then World Catholicism Week, April 7th through the 11th. Lots of events, including two headliners that Brother Orobator mentioned here, Lamin Sane and Philip Jenkins are going to be here during that week to talk about theologies of migration and diaspora. So please join us for those events as well, and please join me in thanking Brother Orobator.
Would also like to say I'm very grateful to the Center for Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, Director Bill, and the Catholic Studies Department Chair Michael for the invitation